It's Margaret Mead who said once, if those of you know her, said that all it needs is a small group of people to change the world, and it's always a telling story. I think one that lives, especially with me anyway. But you can always see this when you hear the stories that we've just heard. It does only take a group of small people to make change happen. I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation now. Obviously, we have the usual jamboree happening in a couple of weeks' time, which is COP, and we'll see whether anything measurable comes out of it, whether any of the commitments to change are upheld. It's going to be talking about financial, green financing, etc., and other such things. But I must say to you, all of you, I wonder, what of COP and what material, measurable, smart change have we seen as a result? So I know you'll have views on this as well, and you'll have views, and I hope that we can engage on that. But centrally, as you say, there's something about how climate change is affecting all our lives, both in terms of infrastructure, but also socially, mentally, emotionally, and in terms of our health. And increasingly, the notion of the, let's say, Strasbourg upholding and also saying very clearly that you have a right, a human right, to have a climate action undertaken to protect your health and well-being. Let's see how far this goes in terms of the next few years. But what's certain, you know this already, is that the pace of change, or the acceleration of the impact of climate change, is upon us. And you saw what happened in Valencia, and I hate to think what's going to happen over the winter and in the spring. And as we know, we don't have seasons anymore, and so it's going to be quite a kaleidoscope of let's say change on the weather front that I'm not sure our cities are ready for, or our countries are ready for. This is the biggest issue, is that we've talked a lot about making sure that we move in a certain direction, we have enough money, but are the cities and municipalities, our national governments, thinking about, I need to be adaptation ready, I need to be shock absorbent or shock resistant, and have I got the systems in place to make sure that if I get a whole year's rainfall in 8 days, what am I going to do as a municipality? I'm not sure if that kind of conversation is happening, which is what we need to be having. So anyway, want to say to you that we did, one of our speakers, Laura Cozzi from the International Energy Agency, cannot be with us, unfortunately, due to ill health, which is a real shame. I know, I'm sorry. We were looking forward to her being here also, but we have others here too, who are equally welcome and also forceful on the subject. I'm going to come to you first, Frank. It was really, thank you for being here. And you're on the executive board, and you do a number of things with the ECB, and it's good to have a bank here on the platform, because it's important that we have bankers in this conversation. Can you share with us what you see the role of your bank, but central banks more widely, in ensuring that we move in the direction we need to in terms of a transition, so that we're able to have finance it effectively, but also that point about, if we reflect on the kinds of flooding that we've had just in the past 3 or 4 months, Central Eastern Europe, what's happened in Spain, a lot of those municipalities are already broke. Public debt is the highest it's ever been. That kind of damage is going to cost also. So there's insurance, but also, how do you look at the transition, but also support the risk that's happening? Over to you, Frank.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and I feel humble after speaking after what I think are two towering figures in terms of courage and wisdom, and but before I start talking a little bit, answering your questions directly, I would like to make a link to what you said to what we do, because there is a very strong link. And in order to explain that, I need to also specify that we are not a bank, the European Central Bank. We are a supervisor of banks, which is obviously very different. Now, you mentioned the Urgenda case, which was a case in the Netherlands. And to just say a couple of words on that, and then translate that to banking supervision. So there, indeed, the case was that by not having Paris-compatible legislation in place, the Dutch government was breaching human rights. And that case was won, and therefore the Dutch government was ordered to have more ambitious climate policies, which they then enacted. That same group of people went after not the government, that in their view and in the end of the view of the Dutch the Supreme Court was failing to make these policies, after one of the highest emitting firms in the world, the Shell Oil Company. And they won in first instance. Shell Oil Company was found to be breaching human rights because they were not on a Paris-compatible path. And the legal reasoning was very easy to understand. The judges said, the climate crisis produces an innumerable amount of human rights breaches. No single actor in the world can address all of those. So the US government, the EU government, the European Central Bank, academics, there's no single actor that can address this. So the only way that these human rights can be addressed is that everyone does their fair share. So how do we determine who's, what is your fair share? And then they said, well, let's look at scope 1, 2, 3 of Shell. You are emitting about 2% of worldwide emissions. So that is what you are going to have to bring down according to a Paris-compatible path. That was the court of first instance. Under appeal, next couple of days, we will see what and it will no doubt be brought to the human rights, to the Dutch Supreme Court. You're asking why am I saying all this? Because we need to talk about the financial sector. The next court case in the Netherlands was against ING. Reasoning being, we have gone after a state for not enacting sufficient ambitious policies. We are going after a highly emitting company. Now we go after one of the financiers of highly emitting companies. So what I do, and now I bring it to our work as a central bank and supervisor, in our supervisory capacity, I talk with bankers and I ask them, do you manage your climate and nature related risks? And among many of those climate and nature related risks are climate and nature litigation risks. So I tell them, it could be already today, it's a risk, because this is not the law in every land. It's litigation that's making its way up in the courts. You said, you explained to us, it took you 8 years to get there. So these are things that take a long time. But there is no longer a zero chance that courts will not find in the Netherlands, but also in many other jurisdictions, that not bringing your balance sheet in a Paris-compatible manner to net zero by 2050 and minus 55 by 2055 will not be seen as a breach of human right, being a tort, therefore you being liable for court action to be actually ordered. So I'm not even talking about damages here, but just to be ordered to bring your balance sheet in line. So this is a risk that needs to be managed. One of the best ways to manage that risk is to make sure that you have a Paris-compatible transition plan, that you have a Kunming Montreal, so it's not just climate, it's also nature, transition plan that is that makes you, if you like, immune for this kind of litigation. So if your question is your work being heard? Is it being translated into the economy? Is it being translated in discussions in the boardroom? Is it being translated in forceful actions by supervisors of banks so that they manage these risks that are related to these court cases? The answer is a resounding yes. That was the link between what you said and what we do. Now, we as central banks and supervisors are not climate and nature policymakers. And that's a good thing. This is something for democratically elected governments. So the Paris Agreement, the European Climate Act, the CSRD, the CSDDD, the Fit for 55 package, all these things have been decided by democratically elected governments and parliaments. So we are not climate and nature policy makers. We are climate and nature policy takers, is the way we always say it. But there is a lot to take because climate and nature, the climate and nature crisis translate into financial risks. And therefore, as a central bank, as a supervisor, we need to make sure that banks manage these risks. So to make that a little bit less abstract, what we have done, we have published a guide on with our expectations how banks should manage these risks. And to make that very concrete, imagine a bank that had exposures for example, mortgages in Pai Porta. You've seen the awful images here on screen a couple of minutes ago. These are exposures that banks have. If these houses are no longer inhabitable, that of course increases the credit risk of the bank. So this is just one example. There are myriads of examples having to do with physical risks. So the floods, the storms, the sea level rise, the droughts, the the wildfires, you name it, on the one hand. But there is also, of course, transition risks. Governments, fortunately, not sitting on their hands, taking actions, phasing out certain products, certain ways of producing things, taxing emission, and all these things make risks or translate into risk for banks. Or to make that more concrete, if you have lots of exposures on the coal mine industry, if at one point governments were to prohibit coal mines, then of course your credit risk increases. Now, so far I've been talking about what we do as a supervisor, making sure that banks manage their climate and nature-related risks, both physical risks and transition risks. But also, as a central bank, we need to take into account the climate and nature crisis. So just before I walked in here, we were talking about the Rhine River having dried up 2 summers ago. That has a measurable impact on German GDP. It had a measurable impact on food price inflation a year after. This is just one example. We know that things like this will happen even more frequently, ever more frequently in the years to come, and we will hear from the IPCC in a minute. So we would be under-delivering on our mandate as a central bank, looking at the economy, understanding the economy, because we need to ensure price stability. If we were not to look into these effects, and therefore we do. So we enhance our analytical capacity here. We have done more. They're a little bit technical, but in the part or in the cycle some years ago, it's now difficult to remember. But when inflation was very low, or actually too low, we bought corporate bonds, and in buying these corporate bonds, we tilted towards buying more green than less green bonds vis-a-vis a situation in which we had just bought, if you like, the market. So we tilted, we went into buying more. We take collateral. So when we engage in credit operations with the banks, which is part of our monetary policy, we make sure that this collateral that the firms that emit these bonds that we then take as collateral, that they comply with the CSRD. So there are a number of measures that we take to make sure that also we, in managing our own risks, take climate and nature into account. We know, and maybe I will stop there. We know that kicking the can down the road, waiting longer. And we don't just say this. So we've done, economic research on this. We've published on this. Makes things worse, because it only will mean that volatility will go up. It will mean that measures that will need to be taken will have to be taken in a more drastic fashion, faster, in a shorter time frame. So a shorter time frame. So a orderly transition, also from an economic standpoint, is much to be preferred. Above a world where, again, we kick the can down the road, we close our eyes to what is happening. So maybe I would like to stop here. We can no longer afford to ignore the climate and nature crisis as central banks and supervisors. By the way, maybe this is what I would like to add still. It's not just the European Central Bank. We are forceful here. And I think in the way that we enforce the banks to make sure that they manage their climate-related risks, and the fact that we use formal supervisory actions, that we use penalty payments to enforce that, is, I think, rather unique in the world. But the fact that central banks and supervisors take climate especially, and fortunately now increasingly, although lagging, unfortunately, nature into account, is something that is being done across the world. There is a central bank and supervisors network for greening the financial system. Um, when we founded this, I was the first chair years ago. There were 8 central banks and supervisors, members of that network. Now there are more than 130. So practically all central banks around the world are a member of this network. So all the things that I've been saying so far are being recognized around the world. Let me stop there.
Sure, Frank. But you haven't said much about the money. In terms of what does that mean in terms of liquidity in your balance sheet or your portfolio of cash to help people? Are you actively earmarking DOSH to create resilience in the system? And you'll say, well, we were a central bank, but you have the both the fiscal and monetary levers potentially, not all of them obviously to hand, but there's ways in which you can operate to make sure that there's enough buffer in your balance sheet to help with the kind of risks that we've seen. Is that the approach you're taking?
So what? So again, what we do in our supervisory capacity is making sure that banks manage their climate and nature-related risks well. But let me go one step further. If they manage these risks well, that means that they can actually take these risks. So there is, of course, another part which is not our job, but it is very important, and it's very good that banks do that. Of course, banks need to be profitable in order to be able to lend to the economy and also to finance the transition. There are many, as we all know, trillions necessary for the financing of the green transition. By the way, not just in terms of the mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation, and not just climate, but also nature. So banks have a key role to play there. But they can only play that role if they are well capitalized and if they have sufficient buffers for the risks that they take, also the climate and nature related risks. So we are convinced that whilst we of course stay within our legal mandate, we are unelected, we cannot make climate policies, as I said at the beginning.
Sure.
We can make sure, and we do, that we do all that we can within our mandate and using all the instruments that we have to place the banks in the best position for them to play the role that they need to play, and we need them to play to finance the transition that is so direly needed.
Okay, I mean, I won't press you too much on this because one of the experiences we had during the financial crash, about 10, 11 years ago, was the fact that banks were hideously badly balance sheet managed, let's put it that way, with hardly any real risk capital involved, and were almost kind of, had hardly any DOSH to deal with the crisis that we were met with. And I'm just thinking that all banks should be thinking ahead, obviously, 5 years or more, and that's saying, actually, this is a kind of liquidity or cushion I need in place to know, because of the analysis of the risk that's ahead of us. So I'm not asking you to answer that question right now, but I'll bring you in because I'm sure others will have that question too. But I want to bring Sinead in, if I may. Thank you. Sinead, I want to move to climate diplomacy, if I may. I mean, what I want to understand from you, given the work you do in the Irish government in terms of foreign affairs, what role can a small country like Ireland play in climate diplomacy with some of the bigger countries? Because people might say size matters, but perhaps doesn't. But in terms of how do you make sure that you're able to use your capacity to promote better ways of working amongst an international community?
Thanks, Dharmendra, and maybe just to say first of all how great it is to be here. For me, you said COP's in a couple of weeks. For me, COP starts on Sunday in Baku, and will go on for a couple of weeks. So it's always a bit of a crazy week, but given lots of other things that are going on this week that we all know about, it's great to be among Europeans. It's great to be among activists, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us. So yeah, I mean, and what better time to talk about climate leadership, indeed. We're a small country. I think the first thing for anybody really, big or small, to think about in terms of climate diplomacy is what we're doing at home. I think we need to. That's a foundational principle. I think for all of us, that there's there's often this feeling in Ireland, if you listen to radio shows about climate, and people will say, "Oh, but we can't do anything. Look at China. Look at these big countries." And we have to remind ourselves that a third of global emissions actually come from countries that are less than 1%. So actually, all of us, we may be small, but it all adds up. So I think, the first thing is to pay attention to, how we are doing climate action at home in terms of can then we be a credible actor on the international stage. I will say we're improving. We've still a long way to go in Ireland, but we're definitely in the right trajectory. But I guess I have one real sort of lesson from our experience as a small country on climate diplomacy, and it's come up a few times actually this morning and also last night at the dinner, and it's about having a really, really tight focus. I mean, I would often be in situations, I might have one person on my team on a negotiation on a topic, and there will be 25 lawyers and so on from, say, the US government or another government. And, if we're not extremely picky what we get involved in as Ireland, then we're just going to be completely swamped. If we try and be a little bit in every room and spread ourselves, it's really pointless. And so, what we really tried to look at when we were, really trying to get serious about this was, well, how will we pick the right thing? So what's the why? Why should we pick a certain topic? And then also, how are we actually going to go about it? And for us, we've made, I think, a slightly unusual decision to really major on adaptation and loss and damage. So adaptation, everybody will know about. Loss and damage, maybe in simple terms, if you're not familiar with it, is really the far end of adaptation, the worst impacts of climate change, often in, say, the small island states or the poorest countries. What can we do about it, maybe when adaptation is too late? So that whole area is quite unusual. Most countries spend most of their climate diplomacy on mitigation, right? On talking to China and so on and so forth. I fully support that, but as Ireland, we were like, what can we really contribute to that conversation? So we kind of looked at our own strengths, our own history, our own relationships, particularly with Africa and with the island states, because we're also an island state. And we said, okay, this will be a good fit for us. Then the question, the most important question, because we're talking a lot today about implementation, which is quite right, is how are we actually going to go about this? And I'll give you an example, maybe quite a specific example, which might help to understand this. I think one particular point for us, and you said it actually, Frank, just there, you said you've got to use all of your instruments, right? We all have different mandates, and what are the instruments available to us? One thing we have is money, right? We spend climate finance. So we're trying to spend most of our climate finance in the same areas where we're putting most of our diplomacy efforts. So 80% of our climate finance goes to adaptation and loss and damage. And so if I just take one kind of specific example to give you a sense of it, some of you may remember back in Glasgow in the COP26, but then in Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27, there was a very big focus on there needing to be a new fund for loss and damage. There's never been a kind of an international recognition that, some countries are just suffering really, impacts that simply can't be adapted to, and there needs to be a special provision for this. And there was always this kind of pushback, by a lot of countries thinking, oh, this will mean liability, compensation, court cases, and so on. But I think we got over that, and we agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh, and this was something that we had kind of, I suppose as Ireland, we'd kind of identified this, okay, this looks like our kind of area you're talking about, the most vulnerable. So we did a lot of kind of technical work and work within the EU also, trying to influence our EU colleagues to get this on the table. So the technical work helped. We had our minister then was the EU lead on this in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The fund was agreed. Then the harder part, designing the fund. So we spent the whole of 2023 in something called the Transitional Committee. I was the Irish member of this, trying to actually design, okay, these great placards, loss and damage, justice, et cetera, but actually, how is it actually going to work? That's the really boring work, to be honest with you. It's very legalistic, it's incredibly time consuming, but it's critical. And I think one of the things I realized was, even though we had put our resources as Ireland very much into this loss and damage space, we couldn't even cover the whole gamut of the design. You know, there were so many issues in this. So then we decided, even within that, we're going to focus. So we said, right, within this loss and damage fund, Ireland's number one thing is, how do we get a special allocation for the most vulnerable countries, the small island states, the least developed countries, so that the fund actually serves them? Because technically, all developing countries, including Saudi Arabia, China, et cetera, could actually apply to this fund. So how do we really make sure that this fund does what, you know, we really believe that it should do? And so we again tried to use all of our instruments. We commissioned research on this. We had events. We did technical work. You know, and I think it's this concept of being like the broken record. Like every time I put up my hand at the transitional committee, people were like, "There is a 99% chance that Sinead's going to say something about vulnerability and a minimum allocation for LDCs and SIDS." And I was like, "I'm happy," because people used to make fun of me, and I'd say, "I'm happy that every time," because you know we don't want there to be any doubt that this is Ireland's top priority. So we managed to, it was tricky. I won't say we got 100% of what we want, but we did get a minimum allocation for LDCs and SIDS despite huge pushback from other developing countries. And a lot of that was working really closely, and it comes back to relationships with the small island states to say to them, what will work for you? What will work for the least developed countries? So we got the decision agreed in Dubai. And then coming back to putting our money where our mouth is, we were able to commit 25 million euros, which is a lot of money for us on that. And now we have a seat on the board of that with the European Commission. So the point I want to make is it's about that relentless focus, and it's about that follow through. You know, you pick something, you pick it for a reason, and then you really hammer home on it. And the last thing I will say is that there is a lot of cynicism just as we come into COP, and we're trying to, you know, agree a new finance goal in Baku, which is going to be incredibly difficult. And there's a lot of cynicism among developing countries that, oh, you guys just care about mitigation. You just want us to mitigate so that you don't have more climate change in Europe. You don't care that we are really suffering today from adaptation and loss and damage. And so, you know, like I said, for us, it's a sincere focus, but I'm also aware that it has a political you know, kind of logic to it, and that we're helping the mitigation agenda by actually not just taking adaptation and loss and damage seriously, but being seen to take adaptation and loss and damage seriously. Thanks.
Thank you. And you know, sometimes some of these distinctions have become false between mitigation and adaptation as well. And I think in terms of how you kind of perceive it, and you know, what you consider to come first or not. But actually, we just need to do both things at once to a certain extent. In terms of, you know, you say you got that huge win. One of the things that when we've had conversations with a lot of the countries in Africa and let's say in Pan-Asia, it's about how money's not coming through quickly enough. So you've got this. This has been the thing with COP, and a lot of the ambassadors that I've spoken to over the past 2 years will say, "Great, but the money doesn't come. We're still waiting for stuff, whilst we're still, you know, hocked in debt with the IMF, and we're having to kind of spend more on that than what we do on education." So is the money? I mean, part of the deal has to be that the money comes quicker rather than just the commitment. Is that what's going to happen on this?
So, yeah, I mean, I think this is a big question. So one of the things we did when we were designing the fund was we tried to make it not the Green Climate Fund, because when you hear developing countries complaining, they're usually complaining about the Green Climate Fund. Now, it's also by far the biggest fund in the world. So, you know, it's not like, you know, we could just set up new funds. We also have to make the Green Climate Fund work better. I think it's starting to work better. They've a sort of a new broom in there, a new executive director and a new team, and they have all these kind of goals, some of which they've already achieved in terms of getting application processes, which used to take for a country, not just the time that countries were waiting for a response, but the resources that countries had to put into the applications were absolutely ridiculous. So now there's like a fund for countries to actually spend the time doing the application process and have the staff, but also there's an effort to make it a lot shorter. That's true. But I think there's a bigger picture in what you say, which is actually around the whole financial architecture, and Nick maybe is here, he's more expert on this than me, he might want to come in on this. But it's also like, how is the IMF functioning? How are the MDBs functioning? The whole debt issue is absolutely crazy. We've actually put some money behind a Kenyan and Colombian initiative. I don't know if people have heard of it, the Debt, Climate and Nature Review, that's just put out its interim report that's trying to make recommendations for the whole debt issue. And it's not that debt, I mean, sometimes as well, there's a bit of politics in a lot of this and performative stuff. Like, we all know, I mean, I've spent many years in Africa. I mean, if you tell me that all this debt has to do with climate, I will have some thoughts on that. There's obviously, there's lots of issues around governance and so on that you could bring in as well. But the fact is, countries are struggling hugely with debt. And, Mia Motley launched this Bridgetown initiative to sort of say, we've got to have some structural reforms because countries are simply not able to recover, and they're not able to take adaptation actions. So yes, it's about the funds, but to be honest, it's more about how the whole architecture works, which is partly about the whole architecture in general being out of date and needing reform. Do you know what I mean? It's not just about
No,
climate.
absolutely agree. And I just think, that's why I think that when you have the conversations at COP, it's so critical that whether it's the IMF or the World Bank are present in that conversation with development agencies and finance agencies, because it's a shame one of our Belgium colleague, who's the chief executive of Enable, is really enlightened in the sense that actually turning debt into finance, and basically saying you can put this into green projects instead. We don't need the money back. And you can do that. You can do that because actually, as a publicly financed body, they don't need profit. So they can actually wipe it off. But you need imagination, etc. in that regard. Thank you for your comment. Diana, welcome. Very good to see you, and thank you for joining us. You're a vice chair of a IPCC committee, and you've been, I was saying this to colleagues here that it must be so frustrating that the IPCC has, over the past 5 years, increasingly raised the kind of red flag from half-mast to full, and still, it's like. You get this kind of ridiculous response from governments. Yet you've been saying it's a bit too late now, and we need to move faster. But from your perspective, you've witnessed over time how we can say this legitimately, the EU, through its Green Deal, through some of the actions it's taken, has been a trailblazer in saying, actually, we're going to finance this in this way, we're going to build it in this way, and obviously then politics takes over to a certain extent. But it has been a first mover in many ways on the climate agenda. From your perspective now, given where we find ourselves, you know more than anybody else how we are going to witness even greater acceleration of the impact of climate change. As I said earlier this morning, Europe's one of the fastest warming continents at the moment, and we're going to get more of that. What do you see as the challenges that lie ahead for this next mandate, and what it needs to get right? Over to you, Dana.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I apologize that I can't be there in person, and it's really a privilege to be invited. And please also note that behind me, this way, it's the CEO and not the IPCC logo, because the questions we are discussing, I cannot direct relate to just from IPCC materials, so I'm not representing the IPCC perspectives. Of course, I am using a lot of IPCC knowledge and wisdom in my answers or what in these discussions, but I'm more in my personal expert capacity. So yes, I felt a little bit of negative connotations in your introductory notes already earlier, and also in the question.
There were no connotations. I was just being direct. Sorry, but please do challenge.
Actually, I think we need to be very, very proud. For example, just the Paris Agreement was negotiated in 2015. At that time, there was absolutely no literature on 1.5 degrees, because how to get there and whether we can get there at all, because it was kind of the hippie science, and we were marginalized if anyone would have talked about that before. So the IPCC was requested to get the science and summarize the science on this. So the scientific community suddenly got together and did all this work. And by 2018, we published our work on 1.5 degrees global warming. That was 2018. Just 3 years later, we are going to the COP in a week, and the COP in just 2021. Already by that time, so many countries had net zero commitments around mid-century that accounted for 90% of all of global emissions. I think that's a tremendous achievement, because that was the first time we very, very carefully dared. We didn't even really say, because IPCC anyway never prescribes, but we just showed this line. If you want to get there, well, actually it happens. Most lines actually happen to cross the zero line at in mid-century. So and we could go on. Also, the fact that thousands of cities have net zero plans, and many of them are very very dynamically moving towards these plans. Just the fact that already there are also dozens of countries which have for already decades managed to reduce their emissions, and while also experiencing economic growth. So I think that we have been achieving a lot. Also, Europe really, as you said, I think I really liked your word trailblazer. When we have been, just look at us. This year, the first half year of 2024, we have been using 70% less fossil fuels to produce our electricity. And this was the first half year when we produce more electricity in Europe from intermittent renewables, so just sun and wind alone. So these two forms alone produce more electricity than all of our fossil fuels together, despite all the hype about, we reopen some of our coal power plants and so on. But altogether, their significance is really decreasing. I think we can be very proud. Also, a very recent data that since 2008, our electricity consumption, despite our population trend, despite more and more media, more and more internet, despite more and more artificial intelligence, our electricity consumption reduced by 20%. And in the meanwhile, our GDP increased by 12.5%. So we are really going ahead. Just when the glass is half full and half empty, we always tend to just focus on the half emptiness. But I think it's very much full. But as you said, it's certainly not enough, and we need to go on, and we need to blaze on. I think what Europe really needs to do a bit better, and that's why it's really what is really hard for Europe, because we are a historic continent and we have historically strong economy. So for us, it's a bit more difficult to do many of the things that China has been doing. For example, they have been, of course, the quickest in, for example, the electric mobility revolution. They're now one in every 3 new cars is an electric vehicle. Why this is much worse in Europe, but still much better than in the United States or anywhere else in the world. But I think what is a really challenge for us is to be able to say farewell to some of the industries, or at least some parts of industries, which have really played a very significant role in bringing us to where we are now, but which now part of them we may either have to just celebrate and just go in different directions, or just do much less. And among these are for example, not only our much beloved car industry, internal combustion engine based car industry with bigger and bigger and stronger cars, and that this dichotomy within Europe, really hugging this and trying to support and embrace that industry and keeping that status quo has been quite a hindrance in stepping forward. And that's just an example of in many other areas. For example, a lot of concerns are to potentially, as a result of the Green Deal and many of our green efforts, to potentially compromise some of our heavy industry, but maybe we don't necessarily need all that heavy industry anymore. For example, we don't need that much cement and steel anymore because we don't need so many new buildings. And it's very difficult to say to a strong industry, which has really been serving us very well, the property industry and construction industry and cement industry, that we just don't need that much anymore. I know we still have perceived housing crisis, but a lot of that is actually due to the fact that, for example, you are now sitting in a city where 20% of real estate is empty. And at the same time, of course, there is still need for some more buildings to occupy. So just to bring all of that to a summary, I think we continue to have to be trailblazers, and we will be able to be trailblazers. But for that, we need to a bit more easier have to be able to say goodbye to some of our formerly very important, historically strong economies, and be able to transform to totally new areas. For example, we should really welcome the new industries related to building retrofits, more digital and service-based industries. And there is a lot of innovation in this area. And if we can just encourage that, what Frank said, there is a lot of investment with that we have to do. But let's use that giant investment not to enshrine the status quo, not to enshrine business as usual, but to transition into a very different 21st century European economy.
Thank you. And it's a good challenge back to what you perceived as being a negative commentary, and it was meant to be. I mean, because whilst I don't disagree with you about the progress that's made in terms of we have commitments to plans, absolutely, and many cities have moved in the right direction. I suppose from our perspective, what we do know, and you know this very well, that majority of social housing stock across Europe is not fit for purpose. Most definitely not fit for purpose for the kind of climate, impact that's happening right now. These are the poorest communities in Europe, and they're living in the poorest stock. And they're the people who have the least opportunity for adaptation. Municipalities don't take very much time to enable communities to know why they need to change their pumps or to get solar or whatever. We don't do that. And so for me, my concern is, and our concern is, that those who are already on the sharp edge will drop off, unfortunately, and will either be hospitalized, killed, or materially suffering as we think through what's going to happen in the next, I'm not talking 5 years, in the next 12 months. We're going to see even more, as you know, in terms of the temperature that are rising and creating a storm, if you like, quite literally. So I think the issue is about pace and having a frank conversation about how you move quite quickly, and not in 5 years, not by mid-century, to a different kind of dialogue and engagement on how you adapt, but also bring communities with you. Because one of the things that's happened in the past couple of years is that we've had people who are, let's say, reactionary to the climate change agenda. And the right has very easily preyed on that sense of, well, look at that. You've silly policies where you can't bring your old car into the town, where it's actually mostly poor people who don't have the affordability to buy a new car. And you think, go figure why people be detached. So I think we need to be thinking more upfront and more in a granular level in terms of the impact on community and types of community. That are most likely to be vulnerable and prey to right-wing forces, but also the economic impact on their lives and the current material circumstances. But that's I've got it off my chest. There you go. I want to bring you in terms of your views. Welcome your reaction to what you've heard. And great. So please, there's a microphone, I hope, making its way to you. Do introduce yourself, please.
Oras Tynkkynen, Member of Parliament from Finland, and I would like to start by paying my respect to the Swiss leaders. I think your leadership really moves me on a personal level, and it really inspires me, and I hope it inspires all of us to take more action. I hate to be the one to bring the post-US election situation to this debate, but I didn't hear it from from any of you, basically. To me, it means that we need to cooperate more with other partners. And I think simply from a very mathematical carbon budget point of view, China is obviously the key player here. And I would like you to reflect, if you will, what we could do more together with China. Perhaps, Frank, you talked about central bank supervisors and having this global network. Do you think we can push China or help China to move their financing away from fossil fuels? They have been one of the main financiers of fossil fuel projects globally. And then, Sinead, you were talking about climate diplomacy. What can we do together with China more? So perhaps if you can all reflect on this a bit. Thank you.
From a politician's point of view, we've heard various statements from the European Commission and the Parliament about not wanting to do business or even speak to China. Where do you stand on that?
If we want to tackle the climate crisis, I think we need to work together with China. I'm sorry to say this. From a very principled point of view, it would be lovely to live in a world where we can just cooperate with people who share our values. We are not in that world today.
Thank you for that. Thank you for being upfront for that. Lady back there in the burgundy jumper, if I say it's burgundy.
Hello, I'm Elisabeth Werner from the European Commission. Thank you very much for having us. There's a number of things that have been said, and I do see a bit, we have the legal and regulatory framework in place in the EU. We do have some finance, probably not enough, although we have emission trading system that of course generates some money for distribution. We do also have quite a lot of other elements, such as the economic arguments. But what we need now is the transition, and it's the practical part. So not the economic arguments, not the legal and the court rulings. We need the day-to-day transition to happen. And that's what you pointed out, for instance, for housing, and where I also take an issue that you can't just say goodbye to some of the old industry. Yeah? It is very hard, and I think industry buys into the objectives, but then we do need money, efforts, and change to happen. And this is the phase that we are in. Now, in terms of the international diplomacy, there is a number of things that I think we have also in Europe that we have proven to work, and indeed the emission trading system and the carbon pricing is at the heart of it. I really do believe that this can work also in other parts of the world. And the second thing is energy efficiency targets. Renewable energy targets, of course, but also energy efficiency targets. And for me, it is quite clear that the EU has big challenges ahead domestically, but we simply cannot afford to only concentrate on what we do among the EU 27. It is the international partnerships and a new way of partnership. So if I can also answer your question, no, we cannot pick and choose. We just have to have partnerships which we tailor-made so that both sides can benefit from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was going to bring you in, but please.
Thank you. I don't want to block anybody, but maybe I can stay here. Yeah, my name is Rong Zhang. I'm from IFC International Finance Corporation, part of the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And thank you very much for us to being here. And I'm very glad to see Frank Anderson and bring some memory. I remember a couple of years ago, in your office, and you talk about, I think the NGFS was 8 countries and talk about the future of a membership. And at that time, IFC also facilitate a network already as a small banking and finance network. And that will have come 20 countries, both public and private. And so 6 years now forward, you have more than 150 countries, and almost all of the central banks, and we have 72, I want to report back, 72 countries from emerging markets only where IFC operate. So I think just a kind of a story that the collective action is not only who is leading, but when you using the convening power bring people together, you actually, this collective leadership emerged even beyond our imagination. We started on 10 countries, 2012. That's a small finance or climate finance world doesn't even exist. I came from the ESG policy team of the IFC. So I think it's really the collective action bring this leadership and ambition together. So I'm also on the way to COP, a lot of talk, and I'm glad is this nickname of this COP is Finance COP.
Yeah.
And I think it's not only about money, and they talk about the kind of $1 trillion annually needed for climate action, but I feel they need a fundamental reform to change the financial system, really bring the climate and development together. And I wondering, and from our distinct panel and also colleagues in the audience is, my worry is about the gaps of climate finance leadership right now. And as we heading to climate finance COP, how can we tackle this? And in my mind, there are three things potentially. Both EU can take leadership and all talk about the collective leadership. One is about policy gap, climate finance policy gap. And I think EU actually is leading in many ways, but there's a lot of problems. For example, the taxonomy, EU started green taxonomy, actually is leading this way. And there's a moment of from 0 to hero. Now it's 50 taxonomies. And I was talking to a French bank in Thailand 3 weeks ago, and they said, we need to implement EU taxonomy. We're based in Singapore, there's ASEAN taxonomy, and we're investing in all the ASEAN countries, and there's Thailand taxonomy, Indonesia taxonomy. So I feel there's a gap of policy alignment, so they can talk to each other. This keyword, the EU actually advocating interoperability.
Yes.
Doesn't have the harmonization, doesn't mean standardization, but it's interoperable and comparable. So that's one, I think, a gap of a leader climate policy. And second, of course, policy is only a means to an end. It's about implementation and impact. And one of the key challenges, particularly emerging market, is the capacity. And I think, Frank, you also mentioned, there's actually failure of education. We don't really have a pool of students and experts educated systematically from university. We have to actually educate ourselves for regulator, for financing and supporting institutions. So there's a gap of capacity. How can EU and others collectively building capacity and technical assistance to have a really pool of experts when the bankers are ready, regulators are ready? And third and lastly, but not least, is again this measurement. We talk about money, we talk about policy, and there's not really consistent measurement framework in place to measure how the money we're spending and the impact we created. It's not really about money. I think it's job created, life saved, and the water saved, all these things, but there's not only the methodology, but also really people sign to it, so then we can compare. So with that kind of a leadership gap in climate financing, on policy, on capacity, on measurement, I really ask the expert in the space and people going to COP that the challenge, but also create this collective action to tackle this together, as together, not only EU, but international institutions like IFC, World Bank, IMF together. And there's a hope. Thank you.
Rong, thank you so much. I'm so glad you came in because there's a kind of clarity and simplicity of what you're suggesting. And you think to yourself, you scratch your head and think that, my goodness, why haven't they thought of this before? And that's my frustration with the, what I call the jamboree, because by having such a big circus, you lose focus and you don't get to the heart of some of the things you're saying. The one thing you didn't mention, Rong, is about how do you get the money flowing more quickly? Because that's the biggest issue for many member states and for the poorer countries, but also poorer communities, is that you find, it's difficult to access it. As we heard, they have to spend money in putting in the application and then waiting for donkey's ages to get the money down. So I think something about speed of financial flows would be really helpful. But let's see. So we've got a couple of lovely. Okay, we'll start with you, sir, then yourself, and then we'll go to you, and then over there.
Thank you so
Introduce
much.
yourself, please.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Ben. I'm the head for Oceans and Regenerative Blue Economy at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And just to actually sort of elaborate a bit on that point, I think in terms of, so here we're talking about climate leadership. I think we should actually include climate and nature because and I think you've talked about that, it really sort of comes together. I just came back from the COP16 in Cali. Very interesting to see the lack of nature and climate leadership when it comes to sort of the political realm. And actually here I want to commend Ireland, because in the climate space, you know, you might be small, but you're mighty. And I think we as a community, we should also sort of really identify those leaders and put our resources and everything in between to be able to sort of support this kind of leadership. But what really struck me at the COP16 is that actual leadership really came very, very strongly from the private sector and from the civil society. Mm-hmm. And it's not antinomic to actually sort of create this kind of leadership. And I think including some government who might not necessarily have at the very top this kind of strong leadership leading the charge might be able to actually sort of open the doors and open the gates to the civil society and the private sector. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, is when we talk about leadership, it's a risky business because you are leading the charge, you're the head of a spear. Now, and that translates as well in financial flows. So for instance, the GCF, I won't enter into the details here, but the mandate of the GCF is to catalyze private sector investment, right? Now, the thing is, in most cases, in fact, in all cases, they will want to see what they will catalyze before they catalyze it. So what de facto happens is that it's actually the private sector that catalyzing GCF funding. Why? Because they are extremely highly risk adverse. So now, at one point, you just need to accept that if you want to lead on the climate and nature space, you will lose money. Though it's better to lose money than to actually lose lives and everything in between. And you just need to sort of the risk tolerance needs to be much, 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 much higher. It's a new sort of, I talk a lot about regenerative blue economy, which is trying to really sort of turn the economic engine, which has been proven to be very effective at destroying the planet and nature and the climate, into a positive driver of conservation, regeneration, etc. But that's a new space. So it's like, if you like croissant, if you like pain au chocolat, you need to invest into the bakery. If no one is investing into the bakery, it's just not going to happen. You will not have any croissant and pain au chocolat to eat. So someone needs to do that, and including the financial sector. And now it's starting to, kind of start in big international cooperation or financial institutions where they are starting to put at risk their own capital. But it's just really only starting. I think maybe here, the central banks, they might have also a role to play to sort of, I don't know, maybe look at some of those rules and regulation in enabling them to be able to take this kind of risk, and as well as the governments. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how can we be much, much, much less risk adverse to be able to lead the charge indeed. Thank you.
But when you go to COP, are these the kind of conversations you're having over there? Exactly. You make my point. Thank you very much. Gentleman back there. Behind you, yes.
Hi there, Nick Mabey from E2G. And as we're praising leadership, I would love to praise Rong's leadership. She has done more on green financial reform earlier than anybody else, I think, on the planet. But you never shout about it. So I thank you for your leadership over the last 2 or more decades, because that's actually where a lot of this stuff gets done behind the scenes where people don't see it. And sometimes we do need to recognize that. So thank you.
Thank you for doing that. You're absolutely right, because she's a star.
I want to go, there is an American election. We've been here before through 2 American presidencies where they pulled out. And it is important to recognize, and I'm going to push back on you on this, because the EU's got to be more proud of what it's built, and it is the EU's built it. Without the EU, it would not have happened. When I started working on climate, business as usual was 4 to 5 degrees. Business as usual is now 2.5 degrees, and everybody met their net zero target be 1.9 degrees. That, through a period of Bush and Trump and wars and terrorism and financial crises and COVID, that's pretty impressive. It's the only multilateral process that's delivered anything like creating a new $2 trillion industry. And Europe's going to need that confidence that it did that for at least the next 5, 10 years, because it's going to have to be not the only, but a really strong pillar in a multipolar world of taking it forward. And I think, so number one for me is, confidence. Confidence that you can shape the world you're in, but only with the right partners. And Baku is going to stress that, because this is going to be a talk about money. There is not enough public money in the world to fill the hole which we need to fill, but we will need to make some guesses about public money to keep the process going. But even more importantly, we're going to have to commit to reforming the whole financial system, which, to be honest, large parts of the governments of the EU in the finance ministries are not very keen on. Not because they're against it, but because they've got plenty of other things to do. So we will need leadership. And we set up this goal, that goal, and this is where COP does matter. COP kicked off the reform of the MDBs. COP kicked off the G20 work on finance. COP needs to now pick off the next round of finance reform. It's not going to run it, but it's got to be the place where the political leadership comes together, because it's not going to come together in the G20. The Brazilians tried that this year. COP has the vulnerable countries that gives us different politics. So that's what I think COP's for, setting those agendas and coming back to them. And it's proved itself to be quite good at that, actually. We have to use it. It's not a machine, it doesn't work on its own. We have to use it. But again, that leadership and Europe stepping up is only going to work if Europeans are protected. And I want to go to Frank on a very significant question. You know, our conversation with cities in Europe, countries in Europe, they're not investing in resilience. Your papers show that. Europe's underinsured. Your papers show that too. Why not? Because if they invest in resilience, it's a cost on the balance sheet. They don't get any benefit. They don't get lower cost of capital. That is a macro question. It sits somewhere between finance ministries and central banks, but neither really take responsibility for it. What do we need to do to make it make sense at a macroeconomic level, so they get benefits from it, for countries to actually invest in resilience, and then that go down to cities and localities? Because otherwise we'll have more and more Valencias, and they get mopped up off the contingency fund. So a lump of money that's not allocated. So they're off balance sheet, essentially. And that is a doom loop. And that's a doom loop for Europe and the small island states and Africa. So for me, that's the task for next few years. What's your responsibility? What do you think the responsibility of finance ministries is to get out of that? So we actually have the incentives to make the choices the scientists tell us we need to do, but literally we cannot do at the moment with the systems we have built.
And at the same time, we see the social contract fragmenting as a result. And when we think about, we surveyed citizens. We've got a colleague here, a couple of colleagues who've been working with citizens and can share more. But it's absolutely clear that a lot of people that we spoke to last year in 7 countries believed that solutions were there, but didn't trust the politicians to do the right thing, or they felt that vested interests were so high in amongst politicians and the private sector that actually no one really cares about them. And I think that these are important. They're more than signals. I think they're clarion calls, and we're watching the impact of that in politics and the move to the right as well, unfortunately. And I think as I said earlier, it's to our peril if we ignore what's happening to people on the ground and community. So, but your points are well made, and I obviously respect what you're saying about COP, but there is a but, is that there needs to be a bit of an engine boost to make it faster. And I just think that, and Ron, you're quite right about that there is enough money in the system as well, I believe. It's how you use it more smartly. But my concern is that adversity will always drive action. And that adversity will be possibly half of Europe underwater. And what will that look like? And what will we talk about at that point, So, and we shouldn't have to wait for that. So there we go. We have comments. I will bring you all in. So Chai, please introduce yourself. I'll bring you in too, and the colleague at the back.
Thank you very much, Dharmendra. My name is Chahaya. I work for the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, and I think that from that perspective, one of the things I've heard a lot about is central government responsibility. I've heard about multilateral institution responsibility, but we haven't really heard a lot about the impact on the local level. And 165 targets of the SDGs need to be implemented by local regional governments across the entire world. And actually, local regional governments face a lot of restrictions when it comes to financing, because of course it's just around the expectation of what you have for decentralization processes, and oftentimes they don't even have the ability to lend directly from banks. So I think one of the biggest things that I'm extremely concerned is that ultimately when we talk about what citizens are going to be impacted by, we don't think about the institutions which are the first line of action for those citizens, i.e. Valencia. I mean, we see it time and time again in Europe, but also in partner countries. And if I think a little bit about the current Commission, there is a massive re-centralization of financing instruments and a massive re-centralization towards, of course, the member state, because right now in Team Europe, the member state is the most important level. And I think I'm quite concerned. I think I just want to make a plea about the fact that we seem to be missing the point that ultimately all of the policies that we're designing have to trickle down to the institutions that then are responsible to the citizens who need them. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a proposition here, but I think we're kind of missing a little bit where the final level is.
Sure, but Chahai, as you know, there is, you've got the C40 network, and other cities, and cities are the drivers of major change on this agenda. And we've worked on this. We know that, in various parts of Europe, cities are the ones that are driving the GDP growth agenda. There is something about innovation in how you use your assets. And I think there needs to be more from, let's say, city leaders who say, okay, we're not going to wait for the EU, because actually there are examples where certain cities have capitalized their assets and raised the money through capitalizing their assets, or played in the money markets. Okay, not Northern Rock, obviously, which was a huge problem, and the banks in Iceland, but where local authorities invested a lot and lost a lot. But there are creative ways of being able to capitalize and think differently about social investment tools at a local level without waiting for the EU.
I would say big cities do have this benefit.
Yeah.
We miss the intermediary cities. We miss the smaller localities.
Absolutely. Thank you. Over here, please. And I'm going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. As ever, it all gets warmed up in the last 5 minutes.
Hi, my name is Anders Storgård. I'm a city councillor in Denmark, and I also work with renewable energy. So thank you for bringing up the municipalities.
And a European young leader.
Yeah, and a European young leader, of course. And the first question that I have is, in terms of climate resilience, my city is based on an old swamp. And we have the issue that with the coming increase of water, we're going to prepare the city so we don't end up in the situation that happened in Valencia. It may be a unique Danish problem, but right now we are under some rules from the Danish government that means that we can only prepare for a 10-year experience, not a 100-year experience. So we simply have a very big issue of finding the finance in order to prepare our cities for the upcoming challenges that we're facing. That's my first question. Do you have any good advice or something that we can do, or policy proposals? The second one is to my Finnish colleague. I don't really think that we are in a situation where we should go to China and teach them how to get off fossil fuels. Because when we look at the numbers of renewable energy, right now 2/3 of the renewable energy that's being built out is currently happening in China. So my question to the ECB would be, what can we do to actually learn from China? How can we make sure that the development is happening in Europe, and that we make sure that we still have an industry? Because that's what I'm most fearful of right now, is we are the ones who are getting behind.
I've got real dilemma. My time is running out, and there's 3 lovely people that want to speak. So if you're happy to go a little bit and miss a bit of your lunchtime, I'm happy to carry on. So the gentleman at the back, I promised, and then Henrietta here, and then yourself. But be really brief, please.
Yeah, and I'm Ben Dekiawar, head of the representation of the city of Budapest to the EU, and I would like to continue the topic which was already raised, the role of the local level in climate action. And I think that it's very important to take into consideration that it's not only the impacts of climate change on local level and cities, but also climate action should happen on the local level very much, as 75–80% of the EU CO2 greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities. So to meet with the joint European goals, we need action at the local level. Also, it must be taken into consideration that ambitious global climate politics is in danger, and not only because of the US election results, but also because of emerging resistance from European member states and emerging populistic, extreme right political forces in the continent. Which means that the Commission might be in trouble to get the support from the national level for an ambitious climate policy. And in this sense, I think that the Commission can cooperate much stronger with the local level, with the cities, which are generally much more ambitious and progressive in climate action. They should do most of the actions which we need. They are ready to do so, but there is a need for a better cooperation with the Commission. There is a need for better financing for climate action and the local level. So I think that there is a lot of work to do in this sense.
Thank you very much. Henrietta. No.
Hi, Henrietta Moon. We're an infrastructure developer. We build energy generating biocarbon facilities. I guess 2 observations from the field. What are blockers in actually getting infrastructure into the ground is, besides permits, let's not talk about that now. One is construction finance and the other one is margins. So really, do national government energy companies, for example, could they flex a little bit on their margins, or could the banks flex a little bit on their margins, especially in the sort of sub $500 million category of deployments, because that's really something that takes years and years for developers to get done, and we obviously don't have those years, especially when it comes to new technology, not just oil companies deploying stuff off their balance sheet. Thank you.
Really good point. I'm glad I brought you in, because no one's talking about how do you deal with margins.
We actually do it.
No, you do, but when you think about what happened in the past 2 years, some of the companies out there had profit in 2 years than they have in the past 10.
Yeah, and for example,
so how much profit is enough?
And for example, wind turbines, their major cost is steel, something like 95% or something like this. But they can't be off-takers for green steel because their margins are so thin and the banks won't let them develop it. So how do we kind of like get this all together?
But you have to be really brief, because I'm now getting messages from everywhere.
Okay, I will try. My name is Eero Yrjökoskinen. I'm from IEP, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, based in Brussels. A lot of talk today has been focusing on public money, but I would like to introduce also the role of financial incentives in tackling climate change. The representative from the European Commission already mentioned ETS. That is in place here in Europe, but ETS doesn't cover all fields. So I would like to hear your views on how do you see this, these incentives, for instance, as a new measure to be implemented also in agriculture, in forestry, and also how do you see the possibility of introducing different kinds of compensation measures in order to introduce more environmental friendly measures? And as a comment to my Danish colleague here, it's good to remember that many of the measures that the EU has already introduced have had indirect impacts on third countries, such as China, which has also introduced its own ETS measure in order to avoid the impacts of CBAM in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. So, and now I've had a 5th person come up to me and say, could you please stop? So I'm going to have to stop. So can I ask both of you to be really brief? So I'm going to start with you, Sinead. If there's, you don't have to make a comment, but you can if you wish to, but briefly.
I'm not going to say very much because I great to meet you guys.
Thank you both. Thank you both.
I basically agree with most things that most people have said, so I'm just going to say a couple of small things. I really agree with the second last point made, or maybe it was the third last. You know, things are not going well anyway. You know, the US, it's not like everything is going swimmingly and then you know, the US administration is going to change. Like, we already are having huge issues. The US is 10% of emissions. There's 90% of emissions that we can all make progress on, even if we don't see enough from the US. But I also just really wanted to supplement that point, that what did we see in the last Trump administration? We saw cities, we saw states, we saw the private sector, you know, a huge kind of subnational surge, and I don't see any reason to think that we won't see that again. But I did want to also agree, it will potentially leave a gap in some of the really important diplomacy with China, particularly on areas like methane that the US was doing, and the kind of, the sunny lands, the sort of pre-COP agreements and so on. So yes, I think we will need to step up, and I think we will step up. And maybe just one last point on the IUCN question about risk tolerance of GCF and so on. Again, I would say, who makes decisions in GCF? It's government. So it's the same point. The whole financial system has a huge issue with risk and needs to really change how we look at it. And maybe Frank can say more about that. But so GCF is simply one manifestation of that.
Thank you. Sorry, Frank, but you will have to be very brief.
Okay. We need, first of all, we need science. So we need to be science, facts-based. With all the implications, no sugarcoating, first point. That means that science tells us that we need to think long-term. So all of you that have been saying things like we need an orderly transition, we need a clear legislative framework, we need to not dial back, we need successful COPs, all that feeds into a orderly transition which is economically much to be preferred over disorderly waiting, kicking the can down the road. Third point, we need action on all levels. So the colleague saying about regions, I couldn't agree more, but this is true for all levels, internationally, nationally, regionally, locally. We need the private sector, we need the public sector, we need academia, we need the media, everyone within their roles, within their mandates, within whether it's public or private, whether you build or whether you finance. You need to always science-based, always thinking long-term. You need to use all you can to get this thing done. A little bit more on the financial side. We need more risk-bearing money. So we talk a lot about the banks, but many of these projects, many of the things that need to be done need equity. So we need a capital markets union. It needs to be in Europe. It needs to be a green capital markets union. So we have much more money, much more seed money, much more money that can be lost in the end by those who can afford to lose this money vis-a-vis banks that have to manage their risks. And then I couldn't agree more that again, we central banks and supervisors are not policymakers, but it would be a great thing if policymakers were to put into place the right incentives. If we had true prices, if there were real incentives, if the ETS were to be broadened to all sectors of the economy, if the if emissions are going to be priced so that many of the projects that today are not profitable will suddenly become profitable, and many of the things that are today still profitable become no longer profitable, as they should not no longer be, because actually they don't bring us where we need to be. Science-based, long-term thinking, all action on all levels.
Thank you.